This is the IDRH DigitalKS podcast, a podcast about all things digital humanities. I am your host, David Tamez, and on this episode of DigitalKS, I speak with Dr. Dave Till. Dr. Till is a professor of communication studies and was recently named a co-director of the Institute for Digital Research in the Humanities. Our topics today will touch on Dr. Till's research, his ongoing and successful DH project of retaking the memory of Emmett Till, and his vision for IDRH going forward. The DigitalKS podcast is produced by the University of Kansas and the Institute for Digital Research in the Humanities. Thank you for listening and enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of DigitalKS, a podcast about all things digital humanities, brought to you by the University of Kansas, the Institute of Digital Research in the Humanities, and its affiliated partners. Today on our show, I am joined by Dr. Dave Till, professor in the Department of Communication Studies, and as of recently, the new co-director of IDRH. Dr. Till, thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure.
So to get us started, could you tell our listeners a little bit about your research interest and how you came to develop those interests?
Happily, my research interests are in the civil rights movement and how that movement is remembered, and in particular, how the story of the 1955 murder of Emmett Till has been remembered. There's a long backstory, and I can go into as much or as little of that as you would like. But in grad school, I wrote an essay on a newspaper article that was published in Look magazine in 1956. When it was published in January of 56, it was 5 or 6 months after the Till murder and 4 or 5 months after the Till trial. But this article in Look magazine went on to dominate the stories that have been told about Emmett Till for 49 to 50 years. And there's a number of reasons that this one particular Look article was so influential, but first and foremost was that this journalist for Look went down there, showed up, paid off the murderers, paid them $4,000, which in 1955 dollars is a lot of money. And in exchange for that $4,000, the murderers signed consent and release forms, which allowed him, the journalist, to tell the story of Till's murder from the first-person perspective of the murderers. And so the text in Look magazine read like a confession. And in fact, some versions of the article say things like, "and then I killed him," or "and then I decided to shoot him." And so this article from January 56 from Look magazine immediately is endorsed by all sides of the political spectrum, including the NAACP and the White Citizens Council. So if you know anything about the politics of the age, you know that the White Citizens Council is a white supremacist organization, and the NAACP is broadly fighting for citizenship rights. And so why do both of those organizations endorse this article? Well, the NAACP was looking for leverage with which to pressure President Eisenhower to take his Civil Rights Commission to the South, and they saw the Look magazine article as proof positive of racial discrimination. The White Citizens Council, meanwhile, recognized that the story, as it was told in Look, was the most sanitized version of the story available. It featured only 2 killers when, in fact, there were 7. It only alluded to the violence, which was, in fact, quite extensive. And so the White Citizens Council kind of saw it as like, well, if this story has to get out, this is the version we want to get out. And so you had the 2 most powerful cultural organizations that sort of orbited in the civil rights orbit, but from opposite sides of the political spectrum. You had both of them endorsing this single story, which meant that, for example, the early African-American Senator, Congressman Diggs, read it into the congressional record. It was so influential that it really sort of silenced all the competing narratives of Till's death, that in those first 5 months between the murder and the Look article, there was all sorts of narratives flourishing about a 7-person murder party, about different murder sites, about different techniques, about different levels of inebriation. But the Look article kind of shut all that stuff down, and for 49 years became the standard story of Till's murder. It perhaps got its biggest bump in 1987 when Eyes on the Prize came out. I don't know if you're familiar with Eyes on the Prize, but if you're currently in your 40s like I am, you probably learned your civil rights history from the massive, 11-hour documentary called Eyes on the Prize. And the first 11 minutes of Eyes on the Prize are all about the Till murder. But those 11 minutes are narrated by William Bradford Huey, the same journalist who wrote for Look magazine. And so what happened with Eyes on the Prize, it's probably the sort of single biggest intellectual oversight of the entire project, is that they let Huey, this Look magazine journalist who had basically made up a story, an overly sanitized story of the murder, they let Huey command those first 11 minutes of what was the most influential civil rights teaching tool of the 1980s and probably the 1990s as well. And so I'm really not exaggerating when I say that for 49 years, the story that was published in Look magazine dominated the remembrance of Till's murder. And in fact, there's a quite easy way to judge that. You can look at, one of the things I've done is I've collected every map that's ever been produced of the Emmett Till murder. And one of the things that Look magazine did is it moved the murder site because one of the people of the 7-member murder party had not signed a consent and release form. So Look magazine had to write that person out of the story, which meant they had to move the murder site about 20 miles east from where it actually happened. And get this, every single map published between January of 1956 when Look comes out and the summer of 2005 leaves the actual murder site off the map entirely and goes with the Look magazine version of the murder site. And that's just like, I could give you other examples, but that's, I feel like, the most concrete example of how this Look magazine article dominated for 49 years. And what happened then is I published this article in grad school, and then just after grad school, a different version of it came out. And by that time, people knew that the Look magazine article was not historically faithful, but they didn't know that the version of the events as told in Look originated with the white lawyers. And that's one thing I uncovered in the archives. And so my article came out, and in particular, a version of it came out in 2012, which very clearly pinned the Look version. It traced it back to the white lawyers who in 1955 had defended the murderers. And that was big news. And this is where sort of events get a little bit fortuitous. At the time, unbeknownst to me, and this is common knowledge now, but all this vandalism was happening. There was a nonprofit that had started putting up signs to commemorate the sites of the murder. They started being vandalized. The vandalism was so persistent and so targeted that in 2014, this nonprofit called a small working group together to address the topic of how do we tell Till's story in a time and a context of vandalism. They invited the Till family, and the family came. They invited the FBI, and the FBI came. They invited a few historians, and the historians came. And then they invited me. And I don't know quite how I made the invite list. Well, technically, I made the invite list because that article I had published about Look magazine was sitting on the director's desk at the time he called the meeting. But I went down there, and honestly, my services were really not needed. If you wanted expertise on the case, they had eyewitnesses, family members who were there. They had the FBI. But I was the only person among the group who had really thought extensively, not so much about what happened in 1955. There were dozens of experts on that topic. But I was the only person who had thought extensively about how and why the story had shifted since 1955. So, for example, I had been able to say why the murder site shifted in January of 56 when that Look magazine article came out. And so this working group saw my contribution as particularly unique and particularly important, and that's what got me in with the Emmett Till Memorial Commission, and that's a nonprofit. They do work remembering the murder in the Mississippi Delta. And I'll pause here, but since that meeting in 2014, I've been working extensively as a consultant, a grant writer, a sign writer, and jack of all trades for the Emmett Till Memorial Commission. And, it's not easy to write about Emmett Till as a University of Kansas professor, as a white man Kansas professor. And I couldn't do it unless I had this relationship with the commission. And it's a great relationship because when I go down to Mississippi, I don't set up my own appointments. The commission sets them up for me, and in many cases often travels with me. And in exchange, I write grants for them, some of which have been quite successful. I do consulting for them. And I've created, we'll talk about later, we've created the Emmett Till Memory Project and given it to them. And so we have this great relationship that makes my research possible and at the same time makes their work possible.
Great. And you mentioned this briefly, and I wanted to sort of bring this out a little bit more. Some of your research concerns, I guess, the topic of memory. Mm-hmm. And so what did this experience, I guess, inform or teach you about the issue of memory or the topic of memory and historical events, at least in this particular case?
So I used to think about the past as this stable thing, that the past happened, and regardless of whether or not we attended to it or paid attention to it, it would remain this relatively stable backdrop against which we could live our lives. The experience of charting the story of Emmett Till, and more precisely of charting the changes in the story of Emmett Till over time, has convinced me that if we don't pay attention to our history, it is going to be stolen from us, right? It's not this stable backdrop that we can rely on to be there when we need it. Rather, it's a fungible resource, right? Like the past is this resource that can be claimed by lots of different competing groups. And if we don't claim our past and share it, proclaim it, advocate for it, that past will be stolen from us. And honestly, that's one of the lessons from that Look story is how easy it is to buy off the past. In that case, it only took $4,000, right? And with that $4,000, we got a white supremacist version of the murder that reigned for 49 years. And so I think more than anything, it has generated in me a certain vigilance over the past.
In addition to, so you've produced some printed work that has, I believe has received some awards, but you also have a digital humanities project that sort of brings in your research. Can you tell us about that project?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And let me start by stressing the relationship between the two projects. So you're right, there's a book project published with the University of Chicago Press. It's called Remembering Emmett Till. It was published in May of 2019. It's what you'd expect it to be of a university press book that speaks to broad public concerns. And yeah, it's done well. But there's also a public humanities and a digital humanities project called the Emmett Till Memory Project. And the Emmett Till Memory Project is a website and a mobile application that uses GPS technology to take students and visitors and tourists to the various sites of the Emmett Till murder. Before I get into the particulars of the Memory Project, I want to stress, because this is not often how it works, I want to stress that the public and digital project came first and the old-fashioned book followed, right? When I was at that meeting in 2014, the very last time I met with the family and the director of the nonprofit and the FBI agent, the director of the nonprofit said, "Our signs keep getting vandalized. Every time we put one up, it gets shot." And so the question was, what do we do about this? And we came up with the idea of creating a digital app on the very basic conceit that you can't shoot an app. It's not impossible to vandalize an app, a mobile application, but it's more difficult than vandalizing a sign sitting in rural America. And so the director said, "That's great. Who will help me?" And I'm not exaggerating here when I note that I was certainly the least qualified person in the room, but I was also the only person who raised my hand. And I expected, and I raised my hand because I was moved. It was a powerful experience to be on site in Mississippi with the family and the FBI, with probably of the 6 or 7 of us in the room. I had people there. I had the only witnesses in the world and the 2 or 3 people who knew more about the case than anyone else in the world. And that was a very humbling experience to me. And so I took on this case sort of being affectively sort of awash in the sort of power of the moment. And I thought to myself, this will be a side project. And it was important that it was a side project because at the time I was working on this book on architecture, of all things. And so I went back to my job here at Kansas and I started to work on it as a side project. And for a very brief moment in the fall of 14 and spring of 15, Google got involved and they offered to make us a prototype. And it wasn't a good prototype. We won't go into that. But we desperately needed a prototype. And so we went with Google and they created it for free with only one string attached that we commemorate not just 5 sites, which was our goal, but 50 sites.
Oh.
And so I didn't know if we could come up with 50 sites in Mississippi related to the murder of Emmett Till. And so summer 2015, I flew down to Mississippi. I rented a car, and for 10 days, the director of the Emmett Till Memorial Commission and I drove around the Mississippi Delta in this rental car hunting for sites. And we had to stretch it, like we had to go to the graveyard of brothers and sisters and aunts and distant cousins, but we got our 50 sites, we got our prototype, and it did what a prototype needs to do. But the larger story here is that it was on that 10-day rental car journey across the highways and byways of Mississippi that 2 things happened. First, I developed this friendship with the director of the commission that lasts to this day. And secondly, I started hearing all these stories about Till's murder that I had never heard before. And by this point, I had been writing about the murder for 10 years, and it kind of blew my mind that there were these communities living in the shadow of the murder that had these commemorative practices that were the stories of which had been untold. And so what I'm getting at here is that it was in the process of making a public humanities DH project that I discovered the stories that eventually became my university press book. I stress that because oftentimes when we talk about DH or public humanities, we tend to think of it as primarily a translation of work that's traditional in the first instance, and then we translate it into a digital medium, or we translate it into a public medium. In this case, the order was precisely reversed, where it was first and foremost a public digital project that eventually became the foundation of a book project. As for the particulars of the Emmett Till Memory Project itself, I encourage you all to download it. It's free wherever you get your apps. It gives you everything you need to make sense of 18 sites in Mississippi and 5 sites in Chicago. And by that, I mean it includes GPS directions, which will take you there, although it's also fully accessible off-site, so you don't need to be there to access the content. It will give you photographs, historical and otherwise. It will provide you, in many cases, with links to archival documents, although that's currently an underdeveloped feature that we're working on developing further. It was released in July of 2019. What is that, about 10 months ago, 10 months ago now? And immediately after it came out, the Till family, now living in Chicago, reached out and said, this is a great project, but Till's story isn't just a Mississippi story, it's also a Chicago story. So in the fall of 2019, myself and some members of the team went up to Chicago, spent a day and a half, about 36 hours with the Till family. They drove us around Chicago in a 15-passenger van. And at each stop, Wheeler Parker, a cousin of Emmett Till and the last living eyewitness, kind of told us his vision of what that particular place meant to him. So based on the itinerary that the family put together and on the sort of significance of those sites to the family, we added in January 5 sites in Chicago. So now when you log on to the app, you'll see 5 sites in Chicago and 18 sites in Mississippi.
Has there been any positive aftermath of your project? How is that original article seen today?
The original Look article is widely discredited. And so this is a form of progress. Now I can't claim complete responsibility for that. I'm happy to help in the effort. But that was a shift that was underway when I got involved. In terms of the sort of afterlife of the memory project, we're just beginning to be able to gauge that. So in the first 9 months, we've had approximately 2,000 downloads. We're currently scheming a number of initiatives to drive that up. We're grant writing in order that we may be able to create a K through 12 curriculum that will be associated with the Emmett Till Memory Project, and that will make it easier for teachers across the country to use it in their classrooms. We have just launched in the last month an extensive online survey of people who have used the project. So we're just now beginning to learn the things that people are learning or not learning from the project. And I only just this morning talked to the woman who's directing our survey efforts, and she tells me that we're at the very sort of leading edge of our beta test. So we have a very slender sample at the moment. But one of the consistent themes is that people want more archival resources. Like when they get to the site, they can read our narrative, but then they want to be able to click to sort of look out to other resources. And we have all those. And we actually have permission to use them. And we have URLs assigned to them. It's just a matter of getting the labor and time to sort of do the work of connecting resources and sort of uploading them to the project. So that's definitely a work in progress. The other thing I'll say about the Emmett Till Memory Project is that we really hope, and this is the thing we're trying to get at with a survey, I don't know if it'll work or not. We really hope that it does not make people more forgetful. Like they don't think to themselves, oh, the story's on my phone, so I don't need to remember it, right? We want people to take responsibility for history, not just sort of rest easy because history is now online. And so what we've done, or what we've tried to do, especially for the Mississippi stories, is we calibrate the story that's told on the app with a user's place in the Mississippi Delta. And so like if you're standing at the courthouse, you'll get the jury's version of the story. Or if you're standing at the hotel where the Black press stayed, you'll get their version of the story. And sometimes the two versions clash, sometimes just slight differences. But our hope is that users will recognize the differences. And that might be too much to ask, I don't know. Our hope is that users recognize the differences and that it sort of triggers a certain thoughtfulness in them. And it triggers them to say, I need more resources. I need to figure this out because this app isn't actually figuring it out for me. And once that happens, like once people actually start taking responsibility for the past, then I feel like I can rest easy knowing that the story, it's not about knowing that the story is now put online and therefore safeguarded for all eternity. It's that story is being wrestled with. And for my part, if that exchange means that people might get it wrong in the future, I'd prefer to have the story be gotten wrong in the future if that means that people are thinking about it, rather than have the accurate story posted online in a manner that no one thinks about it.
Do you hope that, I guess to bring this out further, that it can have some implications about the way events are communicated and reported about? But do you hope that professionals in the business of communicating the news will also kind of think about their responsibilities in terms of reporting the news? Because it can, as this shows, the way they communicate the news can influence how people remember.
Yeah, I hope that's true, David. I fear it might be too much to ask. Like on a lower level, I hope that students who use this app in the context of like pedagogy and classroom exercises, I hope that sort of they recognize it and sort of begin to take ownership of it. I will say that the Emmett Till Memory Project has gotten a fair amount of media attention, very high profile media attention. In fact, I got to announce it, and this blew my mind, but I got to announce its initial deployment in the pages of the Chicago Tribune, wow, and then again in the New York Times. But I must say that what the media largely latches onto is the app as a solution to very high profile vandalism. And they just see it as, look at this ingenious solution. And honestly, it's really not all that ingenious. Like it's the smartphone app. Like we've had this is not cutting edge technology. And so like, as much as like it gets the media attention, I've even tried to pitch like my vision of it, that this is not settling the story, and it's not just putting the story online, and it's not just a solution to vandalism, but it's this opportunity to sort of provoke people to thoughtfulness. I've pitched that, but 9 times out of 10, people just want to write about the sign got vandalized. Now we have an app, and I'm grateful for that. I'll take what I could get. We need all the downloads we can get. But when you ask if I hope that the media eventually, if sort of my vision impacts broader storytelling purposes, well, I dream that would be true, but early evidence is not going to have me put money on that possibility.
That strikes me as interesting, and in part because that's sort of the problem that I guess that led to you studying this event, is taking place towards the very thing that you're working on. This different narrative is being told about it.
Yeah, no, I think I get what you're saying. It is uncanny the ways in which vandalism encircles this project, from a sort of a driving motivation on one hand to also almost firewall that we're begging people to say, you got to see, this is about more than a solution to vandalism. There's something more going on here. But you know what? The app as a solution to vandalism, in as much as it is not what drives me intellectually, it is a great practical solution, and sort of that logic of app as solution to vandalism is what has driven the funding of the project. And so I'm not against, like, it is true, and I'm grateful for it.
Yeah.
And I hope to use that as a platform upon which I can push even further a vision of memory and the importance of safeguarding the past.
What has this experience informed your thoughts and maybe ideas about what sort of impact the digital humanities can have?
Okay, no, that's a great question. So it's one I've thought a lot about as the incoming director of the Digital Humanities Institute. You know, I came to DH through this project. I didn't set out to do DH work. Rather, there was a practical problem in the Mississippi Delta for which DH work offered an economical solution. And so I didn't get into DH by reading about theoretical debates, or I didn't even get into it as an academic field of study in which I could publish. I sort of stumbled into it because in the process of making the Emmett Till Memory Project, I discovered this academic field that had context and thoughtfulness, and there was actually a bunch of other people thinking kind of along similar lines. And I think, I don't know this for sure, but I think that my experience is not totally unique in DH. I think that a lot of people come to it not just as a field, but it's a project-driven field in the sense that people have these projects that are meaningful to them for a variety of reasons, and they find in DH an academic field that grounds those projects and gives them a community of project creators. And so that is to say that the experience of creating and refining the Emmett Till Memory Project deeply informs my vision of DH as something that has the capacity to intervene in American, and not just American, culture. I think it also, DH is, well, let me put it this way. I care about the digital humanities because I have a prior commitment to the public humanities, to seeing research in the humanities, like doing public good beyond the walls of the academy. And digital tools, even simple ones like apps or data visualizations, like those are really handy ways to take traditional humanities research and give it a public resonance that it might not have had. To host at the Institute for Digital Research and the Humanities a commitment to using digital tools to do public work and to really like broaden the narrative about what counts as the humanities and what students who graduate with the humanities, like what are the skill sets that they leave the academy with. The DH has I think, a potential to change that narrative in really productive ways.
You were recently named the co-director of IDRH, as we mentioned. How do you hope your experience so far in the project that you took on inform your role as a co-director and your vision for IDRH?
The easiest way to answer that question is to talk just a little bit briefly about the vision of the IDRH moving forward. The Institute will continue to offer a broad range of services. We are not specializing in any narrow sense of that term, but we will focus our energies on digital storytelling broadly construed. We're going to do this for a couple of reasons, one of which digital storytelling, if you understand it in a sort of intentionally expansive vision, then digital storytelling really captures a lot of the work that's already happening on KU's campus. I think of Mary Emma Graham's work with the Black Book Interactive. I think of Josh Miner and the Indigenous Critical Studies Lab. I think of some of Jermaine's work, Jermaine Halegwa's work. I think of James Yeku's work and Sylvia Fernandez. Like, there's a lot of work going on that we can sort of unify under this broad rubric of digital storytelling. The second reason is digital storytelling is how I got into the business, right? And it's through digital storytelling that I see Not exclusively, of course, but it's a mechanism with which DH can do very public work for the humanities. And in fact, if you dig down into the details of that vision, which are very much like even today being refined, we're trying to put together programming that thinks about the ethics, the politics, and the techniques of digital storytelling. We want to provide platforms for more and more people to tell their stories. And similar to the Memory Project, we don't just want people to put their stories online. We want them to think critically about ways to put them online that are fair to the traditions and knowledges of those people. We want to put online in ways that will further the conversation instead of shutting conversations down. And so just as the ETMP kind of uses a creative twist on GPS technology that is like changing the story as you move, we hope that all our digital storytelling projects will be designed in such a way as to really prompt people to think about the activity of storytelling and its central place, both in the humanities and in our culture. And that's the third thing I'll say about a digital storytelling initiative is, and this is a relatively recent brainstorm for me, but don't you think that storytelling is central to both our culture at large and to the humanities as a field of inquiry? And don't you think also that we could, by doubling down on storytelling, make the IDRH a powerful mechanism that sits right at the intersection of the academy and of wider culture through this digital storytelling initiative?
I am very sympathetic to this idea of breaking down the walls or lowering the walls that separate the academy and the community that it sits within. And I see digital humanities as serving a role that can do that. And that's why it sort of leads me to this question that was prompted by your earlier response. We have public humanities as a growing, as something that's been around for a while, and DH too has been around for some time. As to you, where do those two initiatives come together, and where do they kind of break apart?
Those are good questions. I picture it prompted by you as a Venn diagram. Is that the right term for like partially overlapping circles? Because clearly there are sort of traditions of DH work that don't particularly align themselves to public humanities, or at least weren't born out of a drive towards the public humanities. I'm thinking like sort of the maybe text mining or practices of distant reading or some of the early humanities computing kinds of work are less sympathetic or less driven by public needs. But then I think of a broad domain of DH work about not just storytelling, but archiving, data visualization, collection of oral histories. There is a broad, not insignificant overlap between the two domains. And at the IDRH, we have no desire to make it seem like those two circles are more superimposed than they actually are. And we have no desire to marginalize the things on the external wings of that diagram. But we do want to double down and, to the extent possible, focus our energies on the intersections we can find between the digital and the public humanities. And I think, in a sense, that's going to require us to make a lot of sort of case-specific, day-by-day decisions, trying to weigh this out, trying to find the overlap between those two domains. Quite apart from the IDRH, I also serve as a member of the Public Humanities Working Group that's been convened by the publisher Routledge in collaboration with the National Humanities Alliance. And so I'm very well aware that sort of public humanities publishing really kind of has its own thing. And just as like we can see it from the picture, from the side of digital humanities, we can see how like public humanities could be a tool for some of the stuff DH does. I can report from my conversations as part of this Routledge group, the opposite is also true, that from the perspective of public humanities, they see digital technology as like a tool to be exploited as necessary, and like a tool to be used when appropriate, but they certainly don't see it as a saving grace or like the future of what they're doing. Gotcha. There was public humanities long before there was digital technology.
Right. Do you have any, I guess, in addition to you furthering your projects on Emmett Till, Do you have any other DH projects that you have on the horizon?
So I think the horizon, my DH energy is going to be concentrated on creating and enacting the vision of the IDRH. So that's front and center. And I mean, I will also say that the Emmett Till project, like a lot of digital humanity projects, it's never done, right? And the reason it's never done is because it's funded by grant money. And when you fund things by grant money, you always have to do a little bit at a time for what you get money for, right? And so we have a long list of dreams of ways that this project is going to become better over the years. And so, for example, I mentioned earlier, right now we're creating a curriculum. Right now we're trying to add more archival resources. Down the road, we want to add augmented reality to enhance the capacity of people on site to contrast what the site looks like now versus what it looks like then, because that too is a provocation to thought. Down the road, we also want to add virtual reality, because that will enhance the ability for students across the country to use it. And so when I think about what DH initiatives I'm going to push in the future, it feels like the Emmett Till Memory Project is only halfway done. I'm grateful that it's out there, but from my perspective, and certainly from the team's perspective, it's very much a work in progress. So my time in the future, my DH time will be on that project, and it will be also on the doing work for the Institute.
As someone who's completed or has an ongoing DH project, what advice and general insights can you give to other researchers on the verge of their own projects?
It's a great question. You gave me these questions in advance, and that was one of the ones that's harder for me, because it seems like DH is such a context-specific thing. But I will say, one of my favorite things about the digital humanities is that it also overlaps with the collaborative humanities. Working on a team has been a real surprise, not surprising, but a real pleasure for me over the last 5 years, after being, grad school, rising up through the ranks, writing my little monographs and journal articles. Being a humanist can be lonely sometimes. And it was only when I got into really emphasizing the public and digital aspects of my work that I really found collaboration added benefit. First and foremost, because you can do more things with collaborators than you ever could do alone. And that's especially true in the digital humanities. Case in point, I don't have skills in coding or app building or GPS technology, but my collaborators do. My collaborators don't have the sort of relationships on the ground that I have, or the expertise in the story subject matter that I have. So together we can create things that none of us could have created on our own. And so I hope this is an encouragement to those of you who are interested in the DH projects. Like, you don't even have to have DH skills. I mean, collaboration can help you. At the Institute for Digital Research in the Humanities, we can help you. So I would encourage people to dream big, figure out what help you need, and then find the collaborators you need to make that project a reality.
Well, Dr. Till, thank you for your insights. And on behalf of everyone here at the IDRH and the libraries, we look forward to your leadership and to seeing where you take digital humanities here at KU.
My pleasure.
As always, you can find our podcast on SoundCloud and at our website, idrh.ku.edu. And thank you all for listening.